Let me show you how I turned this into this.
Hi guys, and welcome back to Studio Bon Bon. I'm Siobhan, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. I was blown away by the positive response that I got on my last video. I loved reading through all your comments and hearing your thoughts and advice. It really made me feel like I had found a community of like-minded people, so I'm so grateful that you're here. And welcome to all my new subscribers. I hope you liked today's video because it's gonna be another thrift flip. YouTube honestly has been a great motivation to finally get rolling on these projects, so let's get into it. So this is what I'm going to be working with today. I thrifted this maybe 3 years ago. It's actually Ralph Lauren. It's 90% linen and 10% viscose. Actually, it's only 4% viscose. Also, sorry for the really terrible video quality here. Now, viscose for me is not ideal as far as sustainable fabrics go, but I believe it's biodegradable. And because I'm not buying this brand new, I'm gonna say it's okay for this project. It kind of gives me like Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Martha Stewart vibes, and that's just really not me. It's showing just a little bit too much skin for personal comfort. It's just really not my style. Now I'm gonna tell you the truth. I actually already started hacking this up and experimenting with dyes and different techniques. I really quickly sewed it back together just so that I could show you guys what I'm starting with. Luckily, it's like my exact size, so I think this is going to be a fairly straightforward thrift flip. Let me show you what I'm planning on doing with this. A couple years ago, I had ordered these fabric samples from a shop that I was looking at buying some fabric from, and I really fell in love with this gridded pattern. So I came up with this design, and I loved the idea of these really dark navy, almost black pants with that gridded pattern on them. However, I have not yet been able to find a fabric available for sale that matches this color. I've only ever been able to find this navy color, but I really want it to be a rich, dark navy that's almost black. I feel like that color goes really well with my wardrobe as it is right now. So I sat on this idea for a while, but then one day I was looking closely at the fabric and I thought to myself, like, this looks like it could have just been sewn on. And then I was like, well, why don't I sew it on myself? So I did some tests. I ripped this thing up and I dyed a bunch of swatches and sewed on the grid, and I was really happy with the way this came out. So this is my plan. I'm gonna rip this up, I'm gonna remove the top, I'm gonna dye it, sew the grid on top of that, and then I'm gonna use this extra fabric to make a waistband, and I'm hoping this will make a really nice pair of pants. I'm very excited to add this to my wardrobe. So that's the plan. Woo! Let's go. So the first step, of course, was to rip up the original jumpsuit. I had to do this in order to be able to sew the grid on. The lining was a nice cotton that had been serged along some of the edges, which I left intact because I figured it would make it easier to put back together later. For this project, I used your generic RIT dye. This video is not sponsored in any way. In the future, I would love to learn more about natural dyeing, but I'm not really there yet, so we're gonna be using this for this project. I set a pot of water to boil on the stove and added a whopping 1 cup of salt. Once the water began to boil, it was time to add my dye. I added in about half a container of the navy blue and about 1/4 of the container of black. Then I quickly added in all my fabric pieces, trying my best to keep everything submerged and equally well soaked. It ended up being quite like a game of whack-a-mole, as I was constantly trying to keep the fabric under the water so that it would dye evenly. I let everything soak for about 30 minutes, making sure to periodically lift out the fabric and place it back in so that there would be no trapped pockets of air that would prevent the dye from getting through. However, when it was time to pull everything out, I realized that not only was it not dark enough, but there were some patches that hadn't received as much dye. So I stuck those pieces back in the dye bath for an additional 10 minutes, but it didn't seem to make too much of a difference.
I was going to be dyeing them a second time anyway to get them darker, so I was hoping that that would cover up some of the patchiness. This time I added in half of the container of black and just a little splash of the navy to even it out. At this point I definitely felt like a witch at her bubbling cauldron, but like the good witch. You know, the one who makes you scones and teaches you how to knit. I didn't let it soak for any more than 10 minutes because I didn't want it to absorb too much of the dye. Next I rinsed it under cold water until the water ran clear. On the bottle it recommended to use this dye fixative, and I made sure not to skip this step because I really didn't want it to be bleeding into any of my other clothes in the laundry, or even worse, bleeding into the grid that I was going to sew on later. When I went to rinse them, the water ran almost completely clear, so it looks like it worked.
Alright, so we are now on day 2 of this project. I just got done dyeing and running these through a cycle on the washing machine, and they turned out pretty well overall. As you can see, they turned out a really beautiful, rich, dark navy black. This is exactly the color that I was going for, so I'm very happy that that was successful. The only thing is that the ones that were patchy ended up still being patchy. You can really see it on this one. It almost looks like something was spilled on these at some point, and that affected the way the dye absorbed into the fibers, because it looks more like a splatter than just like a patch. But yeah, I'm hoping that it won't be too noticeable. I think I'm just gonna steamroll ahead. I'm pretty confident that this is gonna turn out okay.
The next step was to mark out the grid pattern, but the more I looked at that patch, the more it bothered me. And feeling a bit discouraged, I decided to call it quits for the day. The next morning, I grabbed a bowl of boiling water, added about 2 tablespoons of the dye, and carefully painted it on with an old paintbrush. And surprisingly, that worked really well. Once I was confident it was going to work, I went in and painted over all the patchy bits. As you can probably imagine, this was very satisfying. I then went in and set that with an iron, and then took my paintbrush and painted on the fixative over the spots that I had just painted with the dye. And oh my gosh, that worked so well. I couldn't even tell the difference. With that fixed, it was time to resume drawing on the grid. Luckily, the designers at Ralph Lauren had already figured out how to match the pattern on this, so all I had to do was use my triangle to match up with the lines of the grain. Once I had the front leg done, I lined it up with the side seam of the back panel and traced the lines straight across so that it would match up. I got a little nervous at this point about whether or not the pattern was going to look okay, so I quickly basted it together so I could try it on. I also took this opportunity to quickly draft out some pockets. I wasn't really sure if they were going to be too bulky for the silhouette, so I wanted to try it out, because pockets are always nice, right ladies? I tried them on and checked the grid all over, and was pretty satisfied with the way that it was matching up across the pieces. And I was delighted to see that my massive pockets that I had drafted fit nicely into the side seams and didn't bulk out too much. So I decided, pockets it is. I cut my pockets out of some old cotton muslin that I had left over, making sure that there was plenty of room for my hand to fit. Then I dyed them the same color as the pants. Next, I marked the side seams where I wanted the pockets to go, because I first needed to sew down those stripes because I wouldn't be able to get to them later once the pockets were on. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Once the stripes had been added, I pinned on the pockets right sides together. Now what I'm doing here is called an inseam pocket. With every project that I do, I try to learn a new skill, and I used a tutorial for this. I'm going to link it down below. I have no shame in using tutorials, and neither should you. Essentially all I did was understitch the pocket seam, and this is going to help it lie nice and flat and not stick out. Once I had all 4 pockets sewn on, I pinned the pants together at the side seams, making sure that the stripes lined up perfectly, or as perfect as I could get it. It's important to note that I did not pin the lining here. I moved it out of the way and just pinned the outer fabric. Then I sewed down the side seam until I came to the pocket, and then sewed around the edge of the pocket and back up the side seam. Now, I have no idea what this stitch is really for, but I like to use it to overlock my seams, which I did all the way around the pocket. And this was the result. The stripes weren't perfectly matched, but gosh, they were good enough. And I love the way that the understitching turned out on the pockets. Now that the front and backs were joined together, I sewed the stripes all the way across the seam to the other side. This way, they would truly match up perfectly. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this did take quite a while, and it didn't go super smoothly. There were a couple areas where I ran out of thread, or the tension got thrown off, and I spent quite a while unpicking some of these lines and redoing them. but look how beautiful they turned out. It's always great when you get to the end of a tedious task, realize how good it turned out, and get re-energized to keep going. Or at least that's how I feel about it. The next step was to sew the front crotch of the pants together. I only sewed the front because at the back I was going to be installing an invisible zipper. This is where the lining was serged to the front, so I sewed through all 4 layers. Now what was very important here was making sure that the stripes matched all the way along the seam as much as possible. Now, I have perfectionistic tendencies, and for some reason this wasn't good enough, so I ended up doing it over again. I actually basted it together, oh my gosh. But in the end, I had to accept that that was as good as it was gonna get. Next, I drafted a waistband using another YouTube tutorial, which I'm gonna link below. However, when I compared it to the bodice, I realized that I only had enough fabric to do one side of the waistband. Luckily, I had this piece of scrap cotton that I had thrown in with the original dye bath. I was planning on using this to make some bias tape to do some finishes with, so I decided to use this for the inside of the waistband to make up for the lost fabric. Luckily, the original bodice already had interfacing, so it would be stiff enough for a waistband. I laid down my pattern piece, traced it out, cut it out, sewed it together, and wound up with these 2 pieces, which I then sewed together. I did understitching all along the inside waistband piece, once again so that it would fold nice and crisply and lie flat. Now, I had recently seen a video of the inside of a vintage Givenchy dress, and in a fit of inspiration, I grabbed some silk ribbon and sewed it along the edge of the bottom piece, just to add a little couture finish. Once I folded it over and started sewing it, however, I immediately regretted this decision. Instead, I moved on to sewing the waistband to the top of the pants. Once the waistband and pants had been assembled, I could move on to sewing the vertical stripes of the grid pattern. It was very easy to mark out straight lines because the fabric itself had textured lines running vertically, so I just had to follow those. Then I sewed the vertical lines all the way from the top of the waistband to the bottom of the pants. This is how it all looked at this point. It was pretty exciting to see it finally coming together. I didn't do any back stitching on the grid pattern because I thought that would be too noticeable. So at this point I had to weave in all these ends, which really didn't take as long as I was expecting it to. It was pretty easy. The next step was to prepare the back seam of the pants for the invisible zipper. Just ignore the chalk here. I thought I was going to take these in, but I didn't end up doing that. When I lined up the grid on the pants, however, it turned out that the waistband was off by about 1 inch. This was definitely a problem. So the way I fixed this was to rip the waistband about 6 or 7 inches, adjust it down about 1 inch, and then sew it back into place. Once everything was matching properly, it was time to install the invisible zipper. I followed a tutorial for this part as well, which I will link down below. Now, I had dyed the original invisible zipper along with the rest of the fabric, but it must have been made from polyester or nylon or some other plastic because it didn't absorb any of the dye. So I did buy a new zipper that matched. The first step was to baste the seam together. Once they were basted, I double-checked that the pattern matched up, which it did. Lining the zipper up with the seam that I had just basted, I then hand basted the zipper into place. Then I flipped everything inside out and ripped the machine basted stitches. Then using my invisible zipper foot, I sewed the zipper down to both sides. It turned out beautifully. As you can see in this shot, I only sewed up through the waistband and not through the waistband lining. Now, the original zipper had been finished with a very simple bias tape, and I wanted to recreate this. But unfortunately, the cotton that I had set aside to do the bias tape with was now in the waistband. So instead, I pulled out some leftover linen fabric from the last project that I did and used that to create a bias binding finish. It was a little stiff because of the linen, but I actually really liked the way it gave some structure to the back of the garment. Now, to finish the waistband, I first moved the end of the invisible zipper out of the way, then folded down the lining so that it was right sides together and pinned it in place. Then I very carefully sewed right up against the edge of the invisible zipper. If this is confusing, definitely check out the tutorial I've linked down below. It goes into much more detail. Then I flipped it inside out and I was left with this beautiful waistband. This was my first time sewing something like this, and I was really proud of the way it came out. Then I finished the pants by sewing up one side and down the other, making sure to not sew any of the lining. I decided to finish the lining with French seams. So first I pinned the lining wrong sides together together. I repeat, wrong sides together. Then I trimmed the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch, which might seem very drastic, but just wait, you'll see. I then turned it inside out, so now the right sides were together, and sewed the seams at 1/4 inch. This left me with clean seams on the inside of the pants, and on the wrong side, the raw edges were all captured within the seam allowance. And that, my friends, is a French seam, in case you didn't already know. To finish it off, I embroidered a little tag with the date on the same silk ribbon that I had used to finish the waistband. I finished the waistband by hand because I really didn't want any stitches showing through, and I wasn't very confident in my ability to stitch in the ditch. Now, of course, there were lots of other small finishing touches that I had to do, like finishing the hems and connecting little bits here and there, but none of that was very interesting, and I know you guys want to get to the final reveal, so brace yourselves. You ready?
I am delighted with how these came out, and I'm not just saying that for YouTube. These might be my new favorite pair of pants. I think the best thing about these pants is the fit. They fit really snugly all the way from my natural waist to the bottom of my hips, but then they flare out dramatically. So they're actually really roomy feeling, almost like a skirt. I can be really flexible and active in them and still feel completely comfortable. And I love that they fit snugly. They're just so comfortable and fun. The grid pattern matches very well across the whole garment, so I'm really glad I took the time to match everything up properly, because I think otherwise it would have been a little bit distracting. I'm really happy with all the finishing details as well on this. It's one of those things where, like, if you take the time to make it look nice on the inside, then every time you go to grab it and put it on, you feel like you're wearing something special, like a piece of art. It just makes you appreciate it so much more. So I'm really happy I spent the time making this something special that hopefully I'll have around for many, many years to come. I will say that these pants are probably just a little too nice to be wearing on a somewhat regular basis. I'd be a little bit worried about getting them ruined too fast, although I would love to wear these every day. They're really that comfortable. So yeah, that's it for this project. I have so many ideas for future projects, and I would love to keep working on these. So if you enjoyed this video at all, definitely consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on any future videos. Look at the camera. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching until the end of the video. We'll see you next time. Bye. You don't know what's going on, do you? You have something to say?